There is a huge category of MCED tests right now, which is multi-cancer early detection. We've built a large service around how do we help people know what to do with these results? How do we guide them? How do we connect them to the follow-up care that they need?
You've said that at the time, you were perhaps the least qualified person to start a healthcare company.
I absolutely was incredibly underqualified on every VC checklist. I probably would have said no to myself too, but I had very high expectations for how quickly we should be getting traction. I had my phone ding every time there was a Stripe transaction. I remember this cadence of the dings just getting closer and closer and closer together. In our first 9 months, I think we did about 600,000 in sales.
How did that deal with Lori change the trajectory of your company's growth?
Shark Tank was absolutely not only the most incredible personal experience for me, but a company-defining moment. The business doubled, literally doubled overnight, and never dropped off from there.
How are you thinking about differentiation with this huge telehealth boom?
People deserve to have access to more information about their bodies. And so I have always erred on the side of, listen, we don't need to have gatekeepers. We do need to have clinical evidence, grounding in scientific data, and clinical support. People come to us because they can't solve a problem. They come to us because they are really hopeless.
I'm Sammi Cohen, and this is Social Currency, a podcast that unpacks the stories that are shaping business, culture, and the intersection of the two.
Today, many people say that the healthcare system is broken. My guest today, Julia Cheek, is trying to fix a key part of that system, diagnostics. Julia is the founder and CEO of Everlywell, the pioneering at-home health testing company that turned diagnostics from something that happened to you into something that you control. Since launching in 2015, Everlywell has become one of the fastest growing companies in consumer health and has raised more than $200 million, proving that convenience, access, and empowerment aren't just buzzwords, they're really the future of medicine. In this episode, Julia tells me about the moment that inspired her to build Everlywell after her own frustrating lab experience, what really happens after a Shark Tank deal, and the split-second leadership calls she had to make during the pandemic when the company scaled almost overnight. She also shares what she's betting on next, from the future of at-home diagnostics and biohacking to how insurance and policy need to evolve for proactive healthcare to actually work. This is Julia Cheek's Social Currency. Julia Cheek, welcome to Social Currency.
Thanks. I'm super happy to be here.
I want to start with your life pre-Everlywell. So you went to Harvard Business School, and after HBS, you went into corporate strategy. How did working in corporate strategy prepare you for everything that you're doing now?
This is a great question, and it definitely didn't prepare me at all. I think it was more my own self-confidence in knowing that I wanted to start a business, but I felt I needed all of these experiences before I did so. It was actually at HBS that I had this real recognition that I was surrounded by all these amazing people starting businesses, raising money. I come from a family with 2 lawyers as parents. I thought you had to go the traditional path, and I didn't even know the concept of being a serial entrepreneur or being able to be an entrepreneur, or that classmates and friends of mine were starting these incredible businesses. I was really lucky to be there during the Great Recession, 2009 to 2011, and people were really shifting how they were thinking about their careers. And so that's really what seeded for me that I knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur. But it was another 4 or 5 years after that before I, one, had an idea that I felt could really be something I could commit myself to, and also had the confidence. Part of my story is that I wish I had compressed that timeline a little bit. I had great experiences. I built great relationships in my work career, but nothing can really prepare you for being a founder. And I don't know that I needed that experience to then do what I did with Everlywell.
After your HBS, your corporate strategy experience, you get to this point where you recognize that expensive lab testing is a problem for so many people. Can you take us back to that moment in time, if there was one, when you realized that this is a problem that really needs to be solved in a different way?
I mean, it was over a number of months, right? And what's really interesting about I think this experience was I already was seeding ground for wanting to start a business. So that 5 years when I was employed at companies, I was like spending my early 20s, mid 20s, working on business plans, meeting and going through different company ideas, working with friends of mine that wanted to start businesses, not like a normal, probably mid 20s activity for most working women. And so that to me was like a hobby. I just couldn't find, I would do a very like business MBA assessment of these different different business problems. I would say, well, I have this problem. Like, what is this industry? Has it been solved? What is the TAM? What's the business model? It was really, really flat. Like, I knew it was going to be really hard. I didn't want to spend all this time, all this like personal energy, my whole life building a company that I didn't feel like was solving a really big problem. And so I was already doing a lot of that in the background when I was working at a big global company. I had no sunlight in my office. I was working round the clock, all different time zones. And suddenly I felt really bad. And I was still in my 20s. And so at the time I was like, oh, it must be something awful, instead of what we all would now know is burnout, vitamin deficiencies, cortisol craziness, right? Hormone imbalances, things that when you work like that end up happening to you, but you're just grinding and you're not paying attention to yourself. And so I went through a real odyssey for 6 months with different specialists, different doctors, all running the same lab tests, all disconnected. And eventually got to a rheumatologist who was able to connect all these dots. But I had to get all my lab records. I had to pay all of these bills despite having great insurance that for whatever wasn't covered. And it just ended up being this process that if I hadn't been so persistent, I never would have gotten to the bottom of it. And I calculated, I think I spent over $2,000 out of pocket on whatever wasn't covered. And I started thinking about it. And look, 75% of Americans were on high deductible health plans at the time, especially young people. So you're paying cash one way or the other. A lot was starting to change in how people were using e-commerce, I'll call it, or digital tools around commoditized products like mattresses, glasses, transportation, prescriptions. You can think of so many groceries, so many categories of these multi-billion-dollar companies were really formed, I think, in that era. And so I thought, why can't we do it with lab testing, which you have to have in 80% of cases to get a diagnosis? It just seemed like the delivery model was so broken. There really been no innovation in terms of how people access testing in decades.
Wow. Without having that personal experience of spending the $2,000 out of pocket, it sounds like you knew that this was something that not just yourself had gone through. This was something that has plagued millions of people at some point in their lives. And I think it's really interesting also that you talked about the time that this was all happening was this boom in all of these different industries, having this, for lack of a better word, revolution in the way that consumers actually directly can connect with the service providers in some way. I want to hone in on something that you've said. And you've said that at the time, you were perhaps the least qualified person to start a healthcare company. Knowing what you've learned throughout your years building Everlywell, would you encourage others to go into the fields that they're not experts in at this point?
Yeah, that is one of my most used sound bites, and now one in hindsight, probably one that I regret the most.
Really?
Specifically because I think women often find themselves to consider themselves underqualified. Now, it is true. I am not a healthcare professional. I still remain not a healthcare professional. I did not have a medical background. I didn't have a technical co-founder. And I really came at this because I was the patient at the center of the problem. And so when you looked at my background when I was raising money specifically, I absolutely was incredibly underqualified on every VC checklist. The only thing I had going for me was I had an HBS degree. So that gave me like a modicum of credibility. Otherwise, I was largely unfundable, and I didn't blame. I probably would have said no to myself too if I was a VC. But I now, looking back, realize probably the only way that this would have worked is if I was the person at the center of the problem. And I think that you see that in a lot of founder stories, at least when the company starts. You have to both deeply understand the problem and deeply be driven by it, because otherwise you're not going to get past the few difficult first steps. I still would say, obviously from the outside, I looked underqualified, but I think people solving problems where they're at the center of it, even in industries they don't know, actually sometimes create the best outcomes. The other thing that I now say is if I had been a doctor, I would have actually known how hard this was going to be, and there's no way I would have done it.
Yeah, they say that naivete for people who are starting companies is actually the best gift, because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And so as someone, especially as you just said, you don't have the industry expertise. What do you do? Do you start reaching out to the labs directly? As you said, you also don't have a technical co-founder. So could you walk me through high level the tangible steps you took in terms of company formation and going to market in those early days?
Yeah. For a little context, my husband and I had just gotten married in 2014, and I was supposed to be the one maintaining the stable corporate job, and he went out to start a company. Less than 12 months later, I'm like, guess what? I also want to start a company. And we were young, obviously did not have kids at the time. And we were like, this is going to be totally fine. We don't live off of a joint income right now. We live off of mine. We'll take the hit. We had just bought a house. So we sold our house 13 months after buying it, moved into a 2-bedroom apartment, and just kind of decided this would be our path for a while. And I think it sounds maybe really, I don't know if it sounds glamorous, but sort of interesting, gritty. It was really, really hard. Really hard. And I think now, again, maybe something that was good we didn't realize going into it, and trying to both be building companies at the same time. So I actually set out to raise a little bit of angel money, not from people I knew, but from folks that were in this space pretty early, because I knew I needed to fund really strong clinical talent. I needed to fund really strong regulatory talent, and I needed to fund product and engineering. You know, with AI now, all of those things, or many of those things, not all, would be able to be done by me. But at the time, that was not a possibility. And so I was able to raise a small angel round from individual doctors and other angel investors who really believed in this idea, either as someone who was a consumer in the problem or as a physician. And that allowed me to spend some money getting contractors, consultants, using equity, getting people on board who were not full-time employees, but were experts in really being able to get us to, an MVP and to get us to beta testing. So I think my first hire was a chief medical officer. I put that in quotes only because I couldn't hire him full-time, right? He came on as an advisor and part-time with us, and he was able to get much more credibility with the labs. I wasn't going to be the person that they would respond to. I needed that conduit and that partner to be able to first get the lab network in place. Then I needed the product and engineering firm to help me design this vision that I had for the actual, end-to-end delivery service process. And then I needed some help from, and I continue to say, like, your lawyers, your regulatory counsel, especially in regulated industries, if you do it right from the outset, it's worth its weight in gold and it's worth the investment. And so those were some of the really early things that I did. I remember sitting on the ground at an airport flying somewhere and setting up our corporate entity. I went into a bank, into Frost Bank in Dallas, and got a bank account. And I was able just to get most of this stood up on a very, very limited budget, but still being able to get a little bit of money from the outset so that it wasn't, funds that I didn't have going towards it.
You and your chief medical officer,
Yes.
in quotes, are working together. Was it this individual's idea of the first product that you were going to bring to market, or how did you even come up with that?
It's super interesting, especially with the functional medicine and biohacking trend right now, because this, time is circular. Trends tend to be a little bit circular. In 2015, there were a couple companies that are still around today called Inside Tracker and Wellness FX that did comprehensive blood panels that were cash pay and delivered you all of your results over time in these really beautifully delivered apps, platforms, et cetera. So maybe what I would call precursors to function. So those existed. And so I knew the science was there. We knew labs did home testing at the time, and I had done all the research on them. And so I was able to leverage some of the folks that had worked there, including this first medical consultant, to be able to come in and help me. And he was an expert in diagnostics. And so I already knew, though, the products I wanted to focus on, because I was solving a problem for my cohort, for women in their late 20s all the way up to mid 40s, who didn't know what was wrong, didn't know why they didn't feel well, were being somewhat ignored or dismissed, or being put in a very traditional specialized medical path. You go to this specific doctor, they look for this specific problem, right? I knew already that food intolerances and allergies, metabolism, hormone testing, thyroid testing, as well as fertility would be really big areas to focus on. And so it was at that point making sure that, one, was the science there to do it well? Were these clinically helpful panels, right, which our clinicians could determine, and he determined at the time? Could we do this in a way that was affordable for consumers? And so I really set that out. But then, I needed tremendous help to unlock these doors and to make this come together. And so, especially as a solo founder, nothing is ever done just by you. It was really that early, what I'll call team, because I ended up not hiring my first full-time employee till probably about a year after I started or incorporated the business. But it was that early team that really made all of this happen.
Wow. So what were the key milestones during those first 2 years that made you feel like, okay, this company is really going somewhere, or was it out of the gate?
It certainly was not out of the gate. I also, as a first-time founder, had set very, very aggressive milestones that were probably impractical in hindsight, but I had very high expectations for how quickly we should be getting traction. Of course, having high expectations is helpful because then even if you just end up a little bit below there, it's quite successful. And so I remember very, very clearly my first full-time hire or first couple was a head of product and had a lot of startup experience. And our first few months in market where we were essentially working through hacking our customer acquisition strategy online, hand-holding every single test as it went through the life cycle, right? Making sure customers were having a great experience. We weren't getting much traction and our CAC was really, really high. And we were iterating every single day. We ended up moving from, weekly metrics to daily metrics and saying, okay, what are our strategies for day over day growth and then week over week growth? But I remember like in June, this was March of 2016. And then in June, I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. Like it's not going fast enough. And I wonder if I should just give all the money back. I remember this very small team, I probably had 3 people saying, just give this another couple months. And I distinctly remember over July 4th weekend, because I was with my family, I had up until that point, I had my phone ding every time there was a Stripe transaction. And so I remember this cadence of the dings just getting closer and closer and closer together. And then I remember my husband that weekend said, I'm going to need you to turn that off. And from there, it really was in hindsight, a very fast process to gain traction. For me, it just felt like things weren't clicking and it was something where I wanted to see progress faster. But basically over that first kind of 6-month period, we were able to grow quite a bit. I mean, in our first 9 months, I think we did about 600,000 in sales.
Wow.
Which at the time was a pretty fast measure of traction.
And so was there a specific catalyst that drove increased sales over that July 4th? Was there a moment, an article that came out? What do you think it was?
We were really like in the days of traditional growth hacking. We were optimizing budgets, trying hundreds of different creatives and A/B testing them. This was still really a meta-driven world of digital advertising, Meta and Google. And I think all of those strategies and having the right experts that had come in and really were in the trenches with me, as with everything, there's never a particular silver bullet, but it was just having a lot of the very gritty, deep technical resources around growth hacking around the table with me that were able to help us push through.
Okay, so I want to get to the Shark Tank of it all.
Yes.
So this happened around 2 years after the incorporation or starting of the company. How did that deal with Lori change the trajectory of your company's growth? And maybe even before we get to that answer of walking through, what was your mentality going into that taping? And were you thinking that you were going to get a deal?
Shark Tank was absolutely not only the most incredible personal experience for me, but a company defining moment. I mean, I have all kinds of positive things to say about the show. And I think it is a really unique thing to be part of such an important brand in American entrepreneurship and business. And it's really shaped my life in a lot of ways. It's the number one question I still get asked is, what was it like being on Shark Tank? And I love talking about it. So I was, and this is I think people like to hear this background fodder, which is I had a really unique chance to be part of TechCrunch Battlefield San Francisco in 2016, about a year before Shark Tank aired. I show up there. It was the only place I've been where the women's bathroom line was like fully available and the men's bathroom line was out the door. I loved it. I was like, this is great. And I was lucky enough to be selected as a finalist. And so I had a few chances on stage and a pretty big crowd to pitch the business. There was a scouting person for Shark Tank there who a few months later reached out to us. And listen, you still go through the full gamut of the audition process, but I didn't have to go stand in a line at an open call, as an example. And so all these little moments, you can only see it looking back, but all these little decisions and the ability to take one moment and then be able to really leverage it as much as you can as a founder, I think is super critical. I would probably never have reached out to Shark Tank if it hadn't have been for that. And it ended up being probably the most company defining moment for us. So I went and filmed in June. It's an intense process. We found out we were airing over Thanksgiving weekend, which is a dream for an e-commerce business, about 2 weeks before we aired. And then we went into full panic mode to try to make sure that, we were able to support the product, keep the website live. We were all hands on deck. I had an incredible team of about 20 people who gave us their holiday weekend, right? And we were in the office, and it was really a defining moment for everyone. The business literally doubled overnight and never dropped off from there.
Given that you've had such an incredibly positive experience with Shark Tank and then, of course, the aftermath of Shark Tank.
Yes.
Can you think of any misconceptions that people have about either going on Shark Tank or the impact to the business?
I think people don't know a lot about how the show actually happens, which is that you as the entrepreneur control your narrative, you control your production, you control your pitch. You are going on just like you would to a venture capitalist, and you are pitching the business. Now, what is different is the cameras are rolling and they don't stop rolling until you walk out of the tank. And so you have to be prepared. Mm-hmm. It can go as long or as short as you have engagement from the sharks, and anything is fair game. I mean, it was something that I prepared for hundreds of hours. I mean, it was such a important moment for me and for the business that I felt a tremendous amount of pressure to make sure that the company was portrayed in a good light. And by the way, probably a pressure I had somewhat little control over, but I knew my words were going to be my words. And so I think it's an interesting framing where you put in the work and you put in the prep and you have final say. And I think that that's empowering as an entrepreneur. Yes, you want to help make, a great episode and great TV and get a deal, but they're really there to support you. And I had every moment of a great experience and have continued to be on the show multiple times with updates, and just am really grateful for how they continue to advocate for us.
That's fascinating, because as someone who works in media, I would have assumed that the producers would be a little bit more hands-on, or like, oh, we know you want to do this type of pitch, but it would be better if you did it this way. So it's really cool to hear that they let you have full reign.
They're there to help you and advise you, right? And to support you. But ultimately, it's your business and it's your pitch. I think that's what makes, look, it's the American dream, right? In many ways, and being on the show. And I think that's what kind of supports that flavor of the show.
I would imagine that the pressure that you also said that you felt totally makes sense. If I were to go on Shark Tank, I'd be like a basket case beforehand. But there's also the other side of it where you happened to have had the most positive outcome. But if you go on and you don't get a deal, I always wonder about those people. And of course, there are tons of cases of that air live on the show, where there's an incredible sounding business. The sharks don't like it for some reason. And I always think about the ramifications of those situations where, of course, you would imagine that it's going to pique some people's interest regardless. I'm sure there's some kind of sales bump regardless, but I always think about that.
We were really lucky both to get a deal on the show and then to have Lori on board and have that deal have a version of the deal go through, right? And Lori has been really, I think, the follow-on support if you do get a deal. I don't know, but not so much the actual happening on the TV show, but she's been the biggest advocate and supporter of the business. She's advocated for us to get our follow-up segments that we've gotten. And she's probably the most responsive person that I know.
Wow.
And you hear that about a lot of very successful people and entrepreneurs. And she certainly is no exception. And so I think all of those factors have helped it to have a lot of staying power for us. They announced earlier this year, I think we're the number 2 or 3 top-selling Shark Tank product of all time, up there with Bombas and Scrub Daddy, 2 amazing products as well. Very different, but amazing products. And so, Lori has really funded a lot of the top companies on the show, and it's been this incredible run. And I think, again, it's the longevity of being able to have that brand behind you.
So when the deal terms happen on the show and the shark who ends up participating says, I want X% of equity and all that jazz. I've heard that after the fact, once the cameras stop rolling, there's still some opportunity for negotiation or conversation. Have you found that to be true, where what happens on the show in terms of the terms, there's still a little bit of wiggle room after that?
I don't know how every process happens, but what is somewhat interesting is that the network has its own venture capital team to do diligence, to make sure that the companies coming on are representing themselves to the sharks.
Oh, that makes sense.
At least in a way that is, somewhat accurate. And then Lori herself has a very successful venture and investing fund. And so she has her own team as well. And so typical to what you would expect in a fundraising process, there is a type of diligence process that occurs after the handshake deal, which can result in any number of outcomes. It can result in different deal terms, but you get a deal done. It can result in not having a deal on either side, right? Whether that's from the company and founder side or from the shark side, or it can result in you doing the exact same deal that you did on the show. So it is an immediate and immediate process that kicks off to get that finalized. But these are very real deals. These are real companies, real investors on cap tables that are sharks, and they bring their full weight to bear for these companies that they're involved with. And so they want to be sure that they're able to represent these brands well. Look, I was on a season 9. They had learned a lot at that point. It's a pretty robust process that functions quite similarly to any other fundraise.
I want to talk about Everlywell and the company itself and the products. So now there are many tests, and exactly how many are on the platform now?
We have over 20 at-home tests, but then we have rapid STI testing that you can get in 15 minutes. We have draw center testing with Quest. So we've really expanded into being kind of a hub for novel diagnostics. And so certainly our at-home tests continue to be incredibly popular. But now it's like, how can we get the best testing and the most novel new tests to people as soon as possible?
I know in the early days you had said that it really started from a personal pain point and you knew exactly the types of tests that you wanted to bring to market. At this stage in the business, how are you looking at staying cutting edge and bringing the next products to market?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you start in these early days and so much of that early DNA still carries through to even our product assessment process, our customer base, how we actually go to market. I mean, look, 75% of our customers remain women. Between the ages of, it's broadened a little bit, but 25 to 50. And look, this is the women are the CEOs of their household. They are the CEOs of their healthcare for their family. They continue to be underrepresented in the medical community and often by doctors. And there have been a ton of companies working to solve this problem in different ways, whether it's fertility or menopause or, sexual and reproductive health, all of those things. And so for us, that's a segment that I think we will continue to stay pretty true to. It's very hard to break away, I think, from a founder DNA. And it allows us to be a much broader, I think, company than we were. But some of that core remains because that's ultimately what resonates with our user base. And so when we think about new products, I'm fortunate that because we have the #1 brand in home testing now in the US, I'm able to get a lot of inbounds from amazing companies. These are large public companies. These are novel diagnostic companies that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. And many know that they don't have the commercial strategy or the commercial arm to know how to bring their own test to market. It can be FDA approved, and they still are sitting there saying, how do we have more people know about this? And so we've become a real hub for these companies to call us and say, hey, how can you commercialize our product with us? Are you interested? And I view it as part of our mission to bring novel tests that are validated and clinically sound as fast as we can to the average American. Because to me, that's how you can actually shorten that adoption timeline and get people, whether it's a Grail cancer screening test, whether it's a Visby point of care STI test that just got FDA approval and we're one of their first commercial partners. That timeline has gone from years to months, short months, to be able to say, hey, look, we have this. And I think that that's a real opportunity for us to differentiate among a lot of the telehealth companies that have fortunately, I think, risen up over the last few years.
At-home testing has really gone from 10 years ago, it was more niche. And now I feel like this is pretty mainstream. But with that being said, what barriers still exist in educating consumers that this is something that they can or should be doing? And what educational gaps are you still seeing?
There were two watershed moments for at-home testing. One was the rise of 23andMe. Every consumer behavior that we see at home with healthcare, I think, was built on this foundation of, could you imagine before 23andMe putting like spit in a tube and sending it in? No. And so you have this immense like human behavior change by millions of people, which is so hard to affect. Then the next watershed moment was COVID. Hundreds of millions of people learning how to follow a direction to do an at-home test. Of course, we haven't mentioned the at-home pregnancy test, which of course women know how to use. But again, this was really in the American culture of shifting entire culture around sending in samples. And so I think both of those things kind of one precursor into then, of course, the pandemic really shifted this to be the norm. And we do feel like it's the norm. I think the challenge remains, though, for the US consumer of, okay, how do I differentiate between a test fully at home, a test that's mailed in, going to a draw center? How do I learn how to collect this sample? There's all kinds of different devices that companies use. And then how do I know what I need and what to do with it? And so we've evolved our platform significantly. We offer clinical consults. Many people use them. In some of our tests, like STI testing, we include a consult and an RX. You don't pay extra for it, right? There's some areas where we have felt the need and really desire and mission to lead with clinical wraparound because we think that we set the standard in some ways. And so I think a big part of the challenge now is how do consumers differentiate between everything in the market? Because you'll see some really low price tests, but you may not know what you're getting or what the science is behind it. You'll see some really high priced products, but you don't know exactly how the science supports that. And I think if we look into trends, there is a huge category of MCED tests right now, which is multi-cancer early detection. There's about a dozen of these tests. The best known one is Grail by Gallery, which we offer. And you're going to start to see these become very mainstream. But the science is often very different behind all of these. What stage of cancer they detect, how relevant it is for people. And so we've built a large service around how do we help people know what to do with these results? How do we guide them? How do we connect them to the follow-up care that they need? And these are very expensive cash pay tests right now. And so I think that's an example where you cannot let the clinical side of this take a back seat. Mm-hmm. It has to be front and center because at the end of the day, these are people's lives. You are delivering care. And even if you put a wellness label on it, you are impacting their care and you are responsible for that.
I love that your company is taking that approach because especially if you are finding out maybe for the first time that you have some condition, mm-hmm. and then the company just drops it in your lap like, hey, surprise, this is something you have to live with and we're the ones telling you. If you just drop them off like that, that is a very jarring experience for the customer. Yep. And you have the ability to completely 180 that experience. Mm-hmm. If you then say, okay, we've given you this information, now we're going to hold your hand in a sense and give you some degree of care so that you know what to do next.
Yes.
If that were to happen to me without that second step, I would probably have a really negative feeling towards the company of like, okay, well, now what do I do?
Right. My DNA has always been people deserve to have access to more information about their bodies rather than less. They are entitled to it if they want it. And so I have always erred on the side of, listen, we don't need to have gatekeepers. We do need to have clinical evidence, grounding in scientific data, and clinical support. You know, for us, that is different than the doctor controls the information. It is, we provide all these wraparound services so that when people need support, we have it. So it still puts you at the center of the experience, but it doesn't leave you on an island. And I think that's the most important thing as we straddle the AI era of healthcare, as we straddle the I control all the healthcare services I buy, which many people now do. They buy all their healthcare services in sort of an assortment, and they control the end data. It's so important that you have that connective tissue to an actual qualified clinician.
We've talked about the growth of Everlywell. To scale to this degree, you've had to raise some funding, obviously,
yes.
for the business. And to date, the company's raised over $200 million. What has been the hardest lesson, or it can be a few hardest lessons about fundraising, especially as a female founder in healthcare?
At one point, I think we were one of the fastest to reach unicorn status for a female-founded company. Fortunately, that's been surpassed. I always like it when we don't hold those titles for very long. So it was really this incredible ride that I had never anticipated. I mean, I couldn't have even imagined doing $1 million in revenue when we started. Like, that wasn't even something I could consider. I knew we had a 90% plus chance of failure, and I put my head down every day and took whatever next step I could to just see if we could make it work, right? That was my goal, is I knew I would regret this the rest of my life if I did not try. But it was really this unique, as you see these milestones occur, everyone says, well, did you know, like, did you think about what your goals were? I was like, no, I didn't think about that. I assumed it would fail, right? How could you not? And I think that's the really interesting part of raising money, building a business, having an incredible team, is you have to hold both of these things at the same time. You have to both assume failure and do everything possible to not have that happen, and then assume you will see this incredible growth and success and plan and execute for that as well. And those are two tensions that you have to be moving forward at the same time. And I think even now, 10 years in, you have to do that. And so when I set out to raise money, I went about it all wrong. I knew nothing about this, right? And I read some books, I talked to people, I tried to do my research, but you can't really form your strategy until you're in it, I think, and have done it. And I started out by talking to VCs, and we were like, maybe had an idea. This is not just a pre-revenue company. This is like me in my kitchen, right? And so I remember, and I was in Dallas, I remember so many very nice people turning us down. I then realized along the way, I started pitching to some angel networks. I made some connections of people really interested in the company who did end up angel investing, that angel investors are actually ones that take the earliest risk, and that I was too early for VC. We were at $6 million in revenue before I was able to raise VC money.
Wow.
We were incredibly capital efficient at that time. And I raised several $1 million from angels. Ultimately, I remember I pitched to an angel group in Austin, and my husband said, listen, if you can raise this seed round, I raised my entire seed round from angels. And he said, if you can raise this seed round, like, we'll move to Austin in 2 weeks. And I did. And we moved down there to build the business. And that was another interesting learning, is the feedback I got at the time, and this was pre-COVID, but I think it is back to mattering now, is that where you also build the company matters, especially for funding, and what ecosystem you decide to put yourself in. And so for me, it was really important that we built in Austin. I could be differentiated from the Bay Area in Austin. At the time, it was on fire as a tech hub. Obviously, it then further kind of exploded like the sun, right? During COVID. And so we moved down 2 weeks later, and I hired my first few employees, and I closed that seed round from angels in 2 weeks. I had so many no's. I knew I only needed one yes. And that seed round, while I ended up getting a few smaller checks in once it had closed and I expanded it a little, it was 2 main people. So you don't need 10 people telling you yes. You don't need tons of people who want to throw term sheets at you. You just need 1 or 2 of the right partners at every stage. And I think this gets over glamorized, especially in the AI era and what's happening now. Fundraising is hard, and you cannot listen to everyone who tells you no or gives you feedback, because you would never make it through. And you have to take bits and pieces and take emotion out of it and just continue forward through, again, whatever next step you can take to keep going.
I love that you really honed in on the fact that you do not need to raise from venture capital first. I think so many people have this misconception that when they are starting a company, and it doesn't matter what industry, that venture capitalists are the ones to funnel money in. And obviously, most of the people who have this notion are generally the earliest stage founders before they've really gotten into the weeds of it. But I think it's a really good call out, because I've talked to a ton of CEOs and founders on the show, and most of them have gone through the venture capital route. Or if they were starting, they maybe got a very initial friends and family round, but we haven't talked as much about angel networks. And it is so critical. I think we need a little bit more of a global PR glow up around angel networks. Many people, of course, people know they exist, but they really serve a very crucial and incremental role in a founder's journey to raising capital.
No, they absolutely do. And listen, I will continue to say it to every founder I talk to. Angel money is the risk-taking money that is the earliest money in the company. And often, by the way, they're never rewarded for this as the company goes on and raises more money and through the exit. Angel investing can be a tricky strategy for those investors. But listen, they very much believe in what you're doing. They have checks to write. They often want to support individuals because it's part of what they're doing for their story, right? They want to be part of these companies and being part of the success. And listen, it is where the early money is. Now, seed rounds have now are now what were Series A rounds, right? The rounds have all gotten bigger and expanded. But if you really look at first money in for pre-revenue companies, I've not done the research, but I suspect you would find angel rounds, especially for underrepresented founders who don't have an in, who don't have a network, who aren't who don't have a track record. Listen, like second time, third time founders, whether failure or success, you will tend to get backed. First time founders that have other underrepresented qualities, it's very, very hard. There's not a right group to take money from. Companies can be built a million different ways. And I try to impress upon people who want to do this and want to raise money, you don't have to go down one path. It's your company. You raise money and you design the strategy for what you want to achieve in the end. And it may not be the VC path.
I love asking founders about their experience during COVID, just because I feel like we're now, a few years, up to 5 years away from that period. But regardless of the industry that you were in, it had such a profound impact, sometimes very positively, sometimes very negatively. Yeah. Everyone has a little bit of a different trauma response to COVID. Yeah. But this is very, very potent given your industry. So I would imagine that the pandemic was a period of tremendous growth for Everlywell. I would love to hear about some of the operational and or leadership decisions that you had to make, maybe some of the most important ones that you had to make during that time.
COVID was like this whole chapter, right? And now I sort of gloss over it. And I think having the life experience, and everyone on my team that had this life experience, was certainly once in a lifetime. I think some would describe it as probably both ways. It was amazing and it was also incredibly difficult. One of the most interesting things I realized in the first weeks, like 2 to 3 weeks of COVID, is that my little company, who had been commercially operating for 2 or 3 years, was actually positioned to have as much capacity as some of the leading labs in the US at the time, which is both concerning and an opportunity. In a matter of days, I went from having my chief medical officer at the time ask me if we should respond to COVID and me saying, no, why would we? Everybody else has got it. The hospitals, the research institutions, the government, all the lab testing companies, like we're a tiny company. We can't help. And two, why would we ever do that? To then realizing almost overnight that we had to respond. And the reason why we were able to be in a position to respond is because we had built a national network. And so we had a system that could integrate laboratories in days, maybe a day. And we had, of course, a home testing network, which meant we had a logistics operation that could transport and courier tests overnight, could get them to labs. And we had a technology solution where people could order tests. And so much of this became clear very quickly. But I just think it's another reminder that you sitting there in a seat as a founder and saying, well, we're too small, we can't make a difference, is absolutely not the case. And in this particular situation, we felt actually required from a mission standpoint to step in and provide help. And in those first few months of COVID, we had materials for tens of thousands of tests that we initially ended up sending to emergency rooms around the country, but we had supplies that others didn't. We were able to provide this response very rapidly because of how scrappy we were. And listen, we had a team that we sat around a table and we all voted to do it. And we had a team that gave months and years of their lives to help us be part of this response when they were also going through what the rest of the country was going through, right? Which was no school for kids, everyone being very nervous and scared. And so I just think it's what happens when you see the best of people in what is a positive crisis for us, but really a crisis moment. And in the time, you don't know if you're making all the right calls, but you make them quickly and with the most information you have. And you have to be confident in that you make the best decisions you can with where you are at the moment.
We're seeing this massive boom in telehealth, right? There is Ro and Hims and Hers and all of these companies that are taking medical opportunities and bringing them directly to the consumers. How are you thinking about Everlywell and differentiation with this huge telehealth boom?
Yeah, I am not surprised at all at the rise of companies like Hims, like Ro. This is responding to a massive consumer need. I also believe that we remain the same consumer population that for decades has been driven to spend around beauty, sex, and diet. When you break down a lot of these top selling prescription medications. And by the way, I myself am a Hers customer, right? I love the product. I think it does for skincare and for hair gummies. I do believe, though, many of these best-selling solutions are tied to those three categories. And that is not a problem, but it is still a reminder of where Americans spend their money and what sells. And so I am hopeful that the rise of this behavior change around telehealth to get treatment, or frankly, not even telehealth, right? Async messaging to get treatment, is able to drive even more core behavior changes around real prevention and health. People come to us because they can't solve a problem. They don't come to us for a much easier conversion, right? Around something for skincare or diet or other things like that, where people are going to spend money to solve the problem. They come to us because they are really hopeless. And I would love to get us, this whole industry, to a place where, yes, you can get the products that you need and want, but you can also solve a really multidisciplinary issue, have chronic condition management, really engage with the appropriate tools and diagnostics and doctors, and actually find this new model that can serve people in rural America, hourly workers, right? Really just become this new way of operating. I think we will get there, right? I think you are seeing this space in digital health change faster than we had in decades before COVID. It's really exciting, but I'd love to morph it beyond some of the traditional areas of consumer spending that we see.
And how do you think that insurance companies and policymakers need to change to make proactive functional care more affordable?
Ooh, this is whole
separate podcast.
Whole kind of industrial complex that we have to break down. And look, what many people don't know about Everlywell today is that a large portion of our business is providing really necessary testing and telehealth assessments for health insurance companies. So we cover about 170 million Americans, and we get a firsthand view of how hard a lot of these plans work to make connection with their members and get them free services. And we provide a lot of those free services. I think, though, much of that is for populations that we know are at risk, that we know are already managing chronic conditions, that we're working to get into the right treatments, screenings, follow-up, and people who don't typically engage with their health. And so there's this huge gap that you're talking about, which is how do we take the biohacking, functional medicine, cash pay world, which, by the way, I should actually be a little more nuanced. The cash pay world is often half underinsured and half insured, probably with higher socioeconomic and income levels. So cash pay world is not just serving what people like to label the worried well. It is also serving people who don't have insurance who really need solutions. But more broadly, you have to be able to take that spend and say, how can these solutions actually make it into the health insurance world? Because if they don't, you're missing just so many people. Most insurance plans are adopting telehealth as solutions. I'm a MIDI customer, and my MIDI appointments are all covered by insurance, right? And so you are starting to see these models come together, but you have to be able to prove you're solving a real or preventing a real and chronic healthcare condition. And so I think it will take, some of these cancer tests, for example, showing that they can detect stage 0 through stage 2 cancers, which prevents cost of care in the system and saves lives. It has to be a dual purpose, right? It can't just be, frankly, I mean, whether or not we can agree with this, it has to be able to not just to be something that spends money. And so unless we're going to fully upend our healthcare infrastructure in this country, you have to be able to work within the system. And some companies won't ever have to do that. But to affect the most people, that's where you have to now do business. And that's why we chose to go down that path as well.
One thing that's really fascinating about hearing your story too, and when I was doing research for this interview, I saw that you were also a board member at Headspace, which is a whole different type of health, right? Mental health. Can you share with our listeners what the responsibilities are of being a board member, and also what's your favorite part?
Absolutely. I love being on the Headspace board. You know, a few years ago, I've now been on the board for about 4 years. I started getting recruited for a lot of board positions. I'm a pretty in the weeds CEO, for better or worse, just how I am, not going to change. So I didn't have really capacity to do much more than one board, but I felt it would make me a better CEO. And I felt that I had a lot of value to add as a consumer healthcare operator and someone who's now also expanded a business into the B2B space. And so as I was getting recruited, I thought, you know, I'd really like to use my experience in an area that I am really tied to, feel very mission connected to, and can actually add value. It probably won't surprise you. I was getting a lot of outreach from recruiters for like, hey, you know nothing about this industry, but we need a female board member. And I'm like, listen, I believe in diversifying boards. I also believe that women can be powerhouse board members and can be matched to actually adding value. So, so I was really fortunate in the case of Headspace that they came to me, we share a mutual investor, and asked me to take that board seat. And for me, they're doing very similar work in mental health as we're doing in diagnostics at Everlywell. And I saw it as a way to expand my own platform into mission-driven areas that I really care about. I experienced severe postpartum anxiety and PTSD. I had a traumatic birth incident. And so I was able to really connect also with this topic and how much work I had done in therapy to be able to work through that. And so it was really a mission fit for me. And that means that, you know, I love the work. The responsibilities are really much, much lighter than CEO, but much more strategic and important in working with the CEO to make sure that we're driving a much longer term agenda for the company. And so that it's just been really rewarding, and getting to work with a new group of people and then bring a new perspective even back to my own work is something I really enjoyed.
Yeah, the fact that you get to take what you're doing every day as CEO and also apply it, but in a new lens, I would imagine it's super rewarding, but you're also symbiotic or mutually beneficial, however you want to think about it, because you're then also what you're learning there, you apply it to your company. That's amazing. Okay, so we're going to go to questions I ask every guest. Can you share a system that you have in place that benefits your career or business? And it can be a system for anything.
I think one of my mental frameworks that I apply specifically at work is I try to take an emotionless perspective around data that we receive. So I'll give you examples. Why has the GLP craze taken off, and what's important that we can learn from it, and what did or didn't work about it for Everly? There have been entire juggernauts built off of this really transformative product. I like to think about things as we are no better than anyone else. We can be outcompeted any day. And I don't have an opinion about a competitor doing better or worse than us. I don't have an emotion around it. What I do like to do is bring it back to my team and say, hey, let's take a look at these things. Let's take a look at this product. What does this mean for us? What I find is it's an unusual framing because I almost always get defensive responses. Well, it didn't work because of this. Well, or emotional responses. It doesn't matter at the end of the day, right? The important part of this is the space is growing. There is plenty of room in the healthcare industry for every company to exist and be very successful. Like, we need a lot of solutions here. I find it as a helpful framing as a founder because if you are able to keep that separation, you can make better decisions from an unemotional place instead of from a place that's not data-driven, that's reactive or defensive. And I've honed that a lot over the last few years. I'll give you one more system which works for me, which is I do not have an X account. I do not have the LinkedIn app. I use it only like for recruiting and on my laptop if I need it. I don't post on there. I have a notice up there that says, I don't check messages. I don't post. I have a Facebook account. I couldn't tell you the last time I was there. And for me, being able to separate and just really focus on delivering the business has also been very transformative for me. I did that in 2020 and have never looked back. And I think for me, emotionally, and this depends on your personality, but emotionally, it is a much better strategy for focusing on the team I have in front of me, the customers I have in front of me, and executing for them instead of worrying about, every person on the internet, which would really be a distraction, I think, in terms of focus and strategy.
And that actually lends very well to the next question, where I am asking you a question from the social currency corner. And this is where I get your input on a trend that's impacting business and culture. What you just mentioned around your lack of social media, which you're very happy about, it comes at odds a little bit with this trend that we're seeing for founders across so many different industry, where they are building in public, which is, one of the terms that people say, or they are really the face of their company, especially as a female leading this massive company. There's also this perhaps expectation that you would be in front of the camera, being a lot more external facing. So I'd love to hear from you how you grapple with that. It sounds like you're quite confident not being on the social media side, but how do you think about your role as an external CEO?
Yeah, I think it has costs, right? And I think there's two types of costs on either side. The cost is to me if I do it, and the cost is a little bit to the company if I don't do it, right? And so which one of those weighs out? I have always been quite introverted. I eloped. I couldn't handle the idea of having a bunch of people staring at me at a wedding, right? And so this is a consistent personality trait for me. Maybe if I wasn't in my role, I might be more like an ambivert, but we are where we are, and I've recognized that about myself. And I think the more that I started leaning into owning that, probably 5 years into the company, the more I was able to authentically lead and really use my energy in the right way. But there's a big but there. I do think even now more so than, 7-8 years ago in the girl boss era, people are building publicly, they're on TikTok, and you can create an exit and a brand entirely through successful social media. I don't know if that would impact us if we did so at this point, but I've had to accept that I can be a real and serious healthcare CEO and not have to put myself in an uncomfortable position for me and sort of my constitution as a person. And I think, look, there are always trade-offs in being a founder and CEO, and it's which ones are you willing to make and which ones are you not. And I think it's an interesting case study, I think, of in today's world, can you see founders being super successful and not building on social media, and specifically women? I think the answer is yes. I've seen many women go before and do it. And I think there are real costs, especially to women, as we've seen, in putting yourself out there and in being the single brand and face of a company. Like 2 days ago, I was trying to look at something on TikTok. This probably makes me seem so old, by the way. And my husband said, "You don't have TikTok?" And I said, "No, I literally do not have TikTok, because I cannot have anything further distracting me from what I need to spend my time on." And I know it would. And so I put those boundaries in place so that I don't have to be focused on that. And honestly, if you can get there, it is really freeing, but there is a cost.
Having a very public founder, of course, helps with consumer, but it also depends on the space that you operate in, right?
Absolutely.
You're very medically driven.
Right.
And this is very different from what we were just talking about with a Row or a Hers, where it's a lot more of a, beauty / physical appearance driven thing. So different need state of when customers or potential customers are coming to you. So if you want my take on it, girl, you're fine. I would not lose sleep over it. And I think also just speaking to the state of where we are and the TikTok of it all in our social media world today, Everlywell has been around for a decade. I would say if you were starting Everlywell today and there was no consumer awareness and you were trying to build top of funnel, I would say I would have a very different answer. Yeah. But as you said, Everlywell has been around. You're the leading at home testing. So you're not necessarily in that same state.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting moment, I think, where you also see people trying to pull away from the social media world as much as possible or put boundaries in place. And I think AI then coming in as well as, a bit of a internet replacement, if you will. We'll see how far it goes. I think we'll see a pretty big evolution in the next few years. And so, we want to be part of it, but I'm always saying, hey, can't we have someone else be a spokesperson? Is that possible? And it's just really hard when you're a founder. I mean, no one tells the story quite as well. And I'm appreciative of that, right? And the opportunity to still tell it, but you have to really do a lot of work to figure out what's authentic, I think. You get pulled in a lot of different directions as a founder, and eventually you have to say, okay, this is actually what matters to me, and these are the boundaries I'm going to put in place. And for me, that's social media. It could be any number of things, right, as a founder.
Okay, let's end with a listener question. So this question comes from Ryan. If you had to start Everlywell again today from scratch in 2025's healthcare environment, what would you do differently?
Great question. And this is healthcare or non-healthcare. I mean, I would build as much as I possibly could with AI. There are companies today that are getting to significant revenue run rate with, a fraction of the employees. It used to be that you had to scale the business by scaling employees. And now the metric is far different. It doesn't mean that people are going to be replaced, especially in healthcare with the clinical need. But it does mean that you can test out a lot before having to hire people, raise money, et cetera. And I do think the expectation is that you're going to have a lot more of your product getting to revenue, having your homework done by the time you raise money than 10 years ago. I mean, you couldn't do anything unless you were that role. You couldn't do anything 10 years ago without being scrappy and bringing people on board. And now you should be able to get to revenue with maybe 1 or 2 employees. For me, it's really exciting. I'm trying to push myself on, being the CEO that can share code with my engineers, which they love. They're super delighted by it. But, that's my job, is to think about how I can reinvent my own role and how everyone can reinvent their own role with these tools. And I think it's maybe the most exciting time to be building a company from scratch. It's harder to be at a scaled company trying to change a DNA with AI. It's hard, much harder. If you are building from scratch, you can start all of that from the beginning with this as your foundation. And it's going to be really exciting to see how companies are built over the next few years.
Amazing. Well, Julia, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
This has been a really enlightening conversation. So much of what we've chatted about today, knowledge is power. And I think understanding your body, your health, having access to information sooner, all of that, there's only upside. Yeah. So I'm really excited about everything that you've built and the future for Everlywell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Social Currency. I've been wanting to launch this show for so long. I can't tell you how excited I am to do this and how thrilled I am that you're actually here listening. It means the world to me. If you liked what you heard today, please rate and review the podcast because it massively helps to support the work I do to bring the show to life. And if you want to keep up with the hottest business lore in real time, follow me on Instagram at Sammi Cohen Talks and subscribe to my newsletter, Social Currency, which is linked in the show notes. Social Currency is a production of Social Currency Media and Money News Network. The podcast is hosted and executive produced by me, Sammi Cohen. Social Currency is produced by the Money News Network team. See you next time.